You knew it was going to come. This day was going to get here sooner or later. It's time to talk about the iconic Ferrari F40. It's one of my all-time favourite cars. I think what hasn't been said about these cars, the journalists all around the world have raved about these. They are phenomenal, and in my opinion, it's probably one of the best supercars ever built. It came out in, I mean, they made these sort of 87, I think they came out, and went on to just into the 90s. And there's nothing much that's caught up with it. Even here we are, 25 or odd years later, and there's not a lot that will touch these. This was all done with old-fashioned engineering. Okay, it had 2 turbos on it, but phenomenally fast. And other cars that have come along after it have all done it with trick computers and trick this and trick that to almost do what they were doing back then. I mean, yes, it's a V8 with twin turbos, 480 horsepower, in 1,200 kilos. So it has got all the ingredients to be a phenomenal car, but I think it really did catch the world by storm, and everyone went, crikey, this is astonishing. And I think when you talk to the owners of these cars, and certainly when I road test, I mean, I've been driving these for sort of 20 years now, 30 years, all the time. First thing you do before you even think about going out in an F40 is you look out the door and see what the weather's doing. Because if it's slightly wet, slightly damp, slightly not sort of dull and crispy, you don't go out in an F40. It will bite you. And these have a habit of just waking you up when you think it's safe, they'll suddenly spin the wheels and catch you out, and you're like, crikey, no, hang on, and they're showing you who's boss. And I think one of the things that I get from these is when you talk to the owners, I think all the owners I've ever spoken to who've got F40s have all had a moment, from extreme moments of spinning to sort of exactly, they're just sort of, the tyres suddenly spin up. I mean, these things spin the wheels in third gear. You can't touch the go pedal in first. You can't touch the go pedal in second. You have to get the thing moving before you touch the go pedal in third. And then you're moving. Things start to happen very quickly, but they will still twitch in third. These are phenomenal cars. So unless you respect it, it will bite you. And it's that simple. And I think all the owners over the years have all had a moment when they've sort of had a bit of a nudge or a bite from the car and all gone, oh, hang on, wakey time. But they're just astonishing cars. I think styling-wise, they're quite sort of brutal. There's lots of ducts and fins to get air through. It was quite functional, but as a machine, they are just astonishing. Obviously, there's an awful lot of engine in here. There's a lot going on. As soon as you introduce turbochargers to a car, you've got your main V8 up the front here, but then you've got turbos at the back as well. So you've got to have some intercoolers. So these big intercoolers, the idea of these is to try and cool the air, because a cooler charge gets more air in. It seems bizarre, but it's the way it works. So trying to cool the air before it goes in. You've got wastegates here that basically bleed off the overboost pressure. Lots of heat shields. These do get very hot. It's quite a confined space, so you've got lots of heat shields and things, and some air boxes at the back. And then coming right to the back of the car, because it's an inline engine, you've got the gearbox behind the engine. So to keep the centre of gravity forwards, they push the engine forwards. In a lot of the mid-engine cars, especially the early cars, the engine was left to right and the gearbox was underneath. When they went to the 288 GTO, we had the engine at the front and the gearbox behind, sort of on that sort of layout. And then obviously you've got the exhaust coming out the back, and then there's the iconic shape of the 3 outlets on the F40. So you've got left and right banks, and then the round one in the middle is actually the outlet for the turbo dump valve. So that's where you get the flames out of when these things are on full boost and getting a bit warm. When the dump valve lets out the overboost, you do get the flames out the back, which is quite an iconic shot from the F40. Other things going on in the back here, you've got obviously oil coolers for gearboxes and engines and what have you. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but it is all pure race car stuff. But we've actually, fortunately enough at the moment, we've got another F40 here. We've just had the engine out, so we can look at it out of the car and see some of the components in a bit more detail. As we say, here's one I prepared earlier. So here's the F40 engine that's out of the car at the moment. We've just been doing some work on it, and you can see once you get all the plenums and the intercoolers that sit here and all the pipe work and plumbing, you can actually start to see the engine. Now the engine is pretty much the same as used in here. This is the 80, so this is the sort of normal flat plane crank V8 that they use through the 308 range, 328 range. They beefed it up for the F40s and the 288 GTOs. The block is slightly different. It's got different oil ways in it for additional oil cooling. It's got another oil rail around the bottom, because obviously there's a lot more power coming out of these than there was in an early incarnation. So it's beefed up to take the power, but basically it's a quattro valve head. So inside here you've got 4 valves per cylinder. You've got the lower compression pistons, because as soon as you put turbos on a car, you have to lower the compression ratio to combat the amount of extra air that's going in. Now, the other stuff that you get, obviously the fuel injection system, and this is a fuel injection system from the 80s. So yes, it was cutting edge then, but what we see now, it's actually quite basic. But what we have got is, you can see the twin injectors. So they run Bosch fuel injectors, and normal cars, they just run one. But when these things come on boost, they need a lot more fuel, so the ECUs cut in the second injectors. This was also used in, Ford used this on the sort of Sapphire, Sierra Cosworth and things like that, the RS500. Anything that's running big boost, you need a lot more fuel in, otherwise you melt the piston. So twin injectors, plenum chamber-wise, relatively small intakes you can see up here. Obviously with the induction. Now, the other thing that's, you can imagine, on the F40s that we've come across before, there's quite a lot of stuff down in the V of the engine here. You can see down in here. And as you've just seen on the other car, when all this is in and all the plenum chambers on, you cannot get to any of this lot at all. It is impossible. And there's some coolant temperature sensors down in here. I'll just pull a plug off. I can do that quite easily. That little blue sensor there is a coolant temperature sensor. There's 2 of those, 1 for each bank. To do those in situ is an absolute nightmare, and these cars are getting to an age now where things are breaking, so you do get coolant sensors go down, you do get pipes that go down. These are old and things wear out, so working on them, if it's down in the middle of the V, it's a struggle. So things like this one, we will replace all the sensors in the middle here, just because while we're there, it makes life a lot easier. Other thing to bear in mind, a lot of these fuel hoses now are starting to rot through. Where you've got air-equipped braided pipes, you can't see the rubber hose in the middle of these. And we've had some of these where they start to leak now. Obviously, no, these things are known to catch fire, so keeping an eye, they run at very high fuel pressure, so keeping an eye on the rubber inside is paramount. Looking at the plenum chamber of this, obviously, you've got the 2 air intakes, all that goes on top of the engine here. But you can see they cross over, so the left-hand side of the air intake feeds the right-hand side of the engine, and you can see these tubes cross over. The reason for that is to improve the torque. If you get, basically the air comes in this end from your intercoolers and everything, and it's all swirling around and mixing up. If you can somehow straighten that air up almost through a tube and then blow it into the top of the engine, if it goes into the engine in a tube, you basically get more air in, so the swirling air will get less of a charge. Straight sort of in a tube, all lined up air will go straight in, so by passing it down a longer air track, it sort of squares the air up. Some of you remember things like the McLaren M8s and things like that had these great big tall standoff pipes on top of the engine. It was basically doing the same thing. So now they do it because of the confines of the engine, they just cross it over. And it's something that happens now in 360s, 430s, they carry this idea on. They all do it, and it increases the torque of the engine. But when you're working on the engine, what you're looking at is what's controlling this side is actually controlling that side. So they do cross over, which can be a bit confusing sometimes. So here's a view you don't see every day. We're fortunate to have an engine out of an F40 at the moment, so we thought we'd sort of show you behind the scenes, because really you don't see it's great behind. There is a reason these cars go so fast, is because they've got a huge engine in the back. This is the hole they leave. But once the engine's out, you can see some of the detail inside. I mean, the chassis side of these, you can see it's still got the rail chassis that was basically used from 328s. This oval chassis tubing here went right through, almost from Dino days really. Dinos, 308s, 328s, the sort of DNA of this car through the years. But then obviously you've got the introduction of the carbon panels, so all the small panels are all carbon fibre. And again, carbon fibre back in the 80s was cutting edge technology. Up until then, we'd had fiberglass, which was like glass strands that were stuck together with resin. But then they came up with this much better idea of putting a stronger weave in straight lines and making this crisscross system, and then cooling it and curing it under pressure. So that's why all the top panels, all the roofs, the bodies and everything are all made of carbon fibre. So this was real cutting edge stuff back in the 80s. Bag tanks, we've spoken about bag tanks on these that need replacing every few years. Again, this was sort of F1 technology really, that the cars were crashing, and when you get a side impact, it was splitting the aluminium tanks and obviously disappearing in great big balls of fire. So they carried this through onto the road cars. So by putting it as a bag tank, which is literally a bladder bag sort of setup, if you do have a side impact, there's a bit of absorption before the thing spills petrol all over the place. So they carried that through. But because they're made of a sort of latexy sort of bag sort of substance, they do need replacing every few years. So, but they're housed inside these bags either side. Dry sump tank, again, all performance race cars keep the oil in a separate tank outside the engine. So rather than keeping the oil in the bottom of the sump where it gets hot and you get oil surge, you pump the oil through, goes into the tank, gets picked up in the bottom of the sump, sucked back out through all these big pipes and put back in the tank over there. So it's held outside the engine. It guarantees you consistent oil pressure because you've always got, you can see you've got sort of 18 litres of oil here coming out of that bottom pipe down the bottom there. So the engine's always going to get oil, regardless of cornering G-forces and what have you, you're always going to get good oil. And it also means the oil travels further. So by the time it's gone through the sump, back to all this pipe work, through the oil coolers and back to that tank, means there's more oil in the system and it's a more consistent temperature. So it's all race cars do that. Other than that, you can see it's actually a fairly simple car. Suspension, Coney coilovers. As we know, the later cars had adjustable suspension, had a little hydraulic pipe going in the top here that you could raise the suspension by a few centimetres. There was a pump in the front. Basically that was for usability, that when you're going over lumps and bumps in the road, rather than knocking the spoiler off every 5 minutes, you could push a button, it would just raise it up. It means you get in and out of garages, transport, bumps in the road. It made the cars more usable. But the more purists of people enjoy the non-adjust cars, just a fixed suspension. It's a fairly cool place to be, sandwiched between two F40s. Now, I thought it was a good opportunity while we've got cars here to just show you through. We've got the turbos and everything apart on this one, but we've got one here that's incomplete. So to go through some of the components with you, as you can see in here, it's all quite tightly packed, as we've said earlier. You've got the intercoolers and the turbos, and it's all sort of tucked away under heat shields and everything where you can't see it. Whereas this one, we've just had the engine out, so we can show you how it all works. And it's obviously the turbos that make the F40 so special. It does give you this huge surge of power that, believe it or not, will spin the wheels in a straight line on these great big, I think 335 rear tyres. If you always squeeze an F40, you never put your foot to the floor on F40 because it will just light the rear tyres up. And so this is how it does it. So you've all heard about turbos. Turbos, basically two fans inside a housing, and they sit sort of about here. So you've got the exhaust manifolds coming out there, and obviously, as you can see on this one, goes round and out the back. So quick, for those of you who aren't familiar with how turbos operate, we try and target these videos of sort of people that just try and give you an insight into some of the technical stuff without going completely bonkers. So if you blow air in here, it'll spin this fan. That fan's on a shaft, so it'll in turn spin this fan. So you've got two fans now going round. So by one being in the exhaust flow, so as the exhaust goes through that one, it spins that one. So if you put this on the intake side, the faster the exhaust one goes round, the faster the intake one goes round, and the intake one sucks the air in from outside and basically blows it into the engine. So what you're getting, it's always proportional. The faster the engine goes, it's almost sort of infinite, that the faster the engine goes, the more exhaust gas come out, more exhaust gas go out, the faster that fan spins, the faster the intake one spins, and it sucks more air in. So it'll just keep going and going and going. And that, therefore, you get the boost. This is why you have to have the low compression pistons, because you're getting a much bigger charge of air going into the engine. On a normal engine, it's just the pistons going down that draw the air in. But now you've got this fan arrangement that's actually forcing the air into the engine. So two things happen then. One, you get too much pressure, because it'll just keep going and going and going to infinity until the whole thing just blows to pieces. So you have to put some sort of regulator on it. So here you have a wastegate, which is basically exactly what it says. This releases the wasted air. So when you get to a point, it's about 1.2 to 1.5 bar on an F40, depending on how it's going, that when it builds up, there's a spring in here, a diaphragm, and down in there's a valve. So when the pressure overcomes the spring in this chamber, it's just a big coil spring and a diaphragm basically. When that opens, then the pressure gets too great here, it'll push that spring up, open the valve and allow the waste air to come out of this little Y section, which then comes out of this centre exhaust. So this is your wastegate exhaust, and that's where you get your flames and things when it's all a bit hot. So this will consistently just keep opening and closing. So it builds up the pressure, releases the pressure, builds up the pressure, releases the pressure. Now, there's also a few more sensors on the ECU, and there's a vacuum side of it as well. You can see there's a vacuum pipe here, so they run a vacuum assist as well on this through a solenoid valve. So the ECUs are controlling what's going on, and there's also an engine cut on these. There's a map sensor on the side that if it all gets too much, it will actually cut the ignition system before you blow the thing to pieces. So that's basically how it works. So this is why you've heard the term turbo lag, that as cars accelerate, as the engine starts to build up speed, the exhaust starts to build up an exit speed, which then spins the intake. So you need that to happen. So you end up with this sort of slow, nothing, and then the turbos come in, you get this huge rush of power, and you're off. Now, some of the early cars, Porsche did this, they had one turbo, and it was a great big thing, so it took a lot longer to spin up. So you had this great big fan spinning up, and then suddenly this enormous surge of power arrived, and the thing spun you around. So what these use, they're quite small turbos. They're much smaller turbos. They spin up quicker, so your time of having turbo lag is much less. So that's why they do it, and it works brilliantly well. No, you can't deny these are astonishingly quick cars, and for their day, they're brilliant. The other thing is these look like radiators. All turbo cars have these. These are called intercoolers. As you can see on these cars, there's a lot of heat. As I mentioned previously, the cooler the air going into the engine, the better it burns. It seems bizarre that you'd have thought hot air would burn better, but it isn't. It's a proven fact that the cooler the air, the better it burns. So if you can cool the air down, so you can see on here, I've got a very big intake and an outtake. So if you can cool the air basically on its way to the engine, so it comes in from the air filters, in through there, through the air ducting, into the intercoolers, and then from the intercoolers into the engine via the turbo. So that tries to cool the air down to get it as cool as possible. Time to talk about weave, the most popular subject when everyone talks about F40s, especially now when people are buying them. Obviously these cars have gone up significantly in current times. I remember when these were sort of 200,000 or so, and used to go to Ferrari track days. You actually see these cars out on track days, and they were used. Now they've gone up significantly, so we are talking sort of millions for these now. So they don't get used so much, but they become more of an asset when people want to buy them, and there's a massive difference between the good ones and the ones that are not so good or been crashed. So everyone's asked a question about weave. These cars came out with very little paint on, such little paint that you could see the carbon weave through the paintwork. So you were looking along spoilers and roofs. So if you could see the weave around the car, then you knew it hadn't been crashed, because it's very, very hard to reproduce. So we have done it over the years to repaint these cars, but generally the ones that have been repainted, the paint goes on much thicker and it covers up all the weave. So the original cars have got the weave. The trouble was, when these cars were new, they were coming through and the owners were sort of looking at them going, crikey, I've waited all this time for a car, I've paid all this money, and the paintwork's awful. And to be honest, it was very basic paint. So they were getting repainted. So you get these with some of the ones with overspray inside the fins and overspray up in the air ducts. And I've known people with one owner cars go, yes, no, this is original. I've never painted it, and that's how they left the factory. That if there was any mark or anything, because cars do get damaged sometimes and they're touched in. So there was a massive disparity on weave even when they were new. And some people were saying, well, I don't want that. So the cars were repainted from original just to get rid of all the weave and the horrible ends. And we'll show you in a minute that you can see inside the doors there was all sort of fluffy edges where the carbon fibre was. So to try and buy one of these cars now, sort of 20 or 30 years later, whether it's got original weave and whether it's got original panel gaps and all the rest of it is very hard. They're a very, very hard car to buy. But every now and again you just get one that's got everything. I was fortunate enough to be judging at the Ferrari Owners Club concourse last year, pre-COVID and everything, and an F40 turned up and it was spectacular, and we all just stood there and thought, crikey, no, we'd never seen anything like this. It had all the weave, had all the country stamps on the suspension, it had the books, the watch, the Shidoni luggage, it had everything. But you don't see those very often. What we used to have, you used to build cars with fiberglass, which is a glass fibre mesh, and you can see it's quite fragile and it just falls to pieces. As soon as you pull it, it comes apart, and it's only really the resin that holds it together. So when you put resin on, it makes it quite strong. But this stuff, those bits off. Right, so this is the matting that starts off the roof, the panels on this, and you can see that you've got you can see where the texture that comes through when you paint it comes back off. Now this stuff is ridiculously strong. No, even like this, where I've just pulled the fiberglass apart, I couldn't tear that even if I tried. So this is immensely strong. It's even quite hard to cut with scissors. So when you put the resin with it, it really is super, super strong. So got my props going. We're going on props today, so blowing off of that. Right, so once you've resined it up, it's like this, and it becomes very strong. And obviously, I mean, this is back in the 80s, so the development of this product has really come on a long way now. So what everybody wants, you want to see this weave under your paint. Now, it can be done. It's very, very hard to do. But one of the things with the F40s, as I've said, that there's so little paint on it that it sinks back and you see this weave. One of the quirky little details that I've seen on these over the years, and some of the bits of this car are quite basic, but then other things have been really thought out. You've got the pop-up headlights with your headlights here, and then down in here you've got your side lights and your full beam headlights and your indicator. Because they've covered them up, and obviously due to the fact that it's fairly basic inside, there was a chance of getting moisture in. They've actually put little heating elements in it, so you get little heated sort of lenses in the front to keep the moisture out of the headlights. And it's the only Ferrari I've ever seen that's got that in it. Everyone else just gets misted up headlight pods. But just something about the detail of how special these cars were. And you've got to remember, back in the day, this was the last car that was signed off by Enzo Ferrari personally before he passed away. So there's little things like that I bet it was him that picked up on and said, no, we need to do that and just get that right. You can see in here, I mean, this is a car that's with us for service. So you can see you've got all the original carbon under the front. Really nicely done, but all the bits that are normally covered up, all exposed. You've got the headlight motors and everything going on here, ducts to get air out, intake for the heating system so you get a bit of hot air inside. Obviously very nice to see the luggage, as we've mentioned before. Some cars do come through with the luggage in, and they're beautifully done from Shidoni, as I've spoken about before. No, the Shidoni family in Italy do a beautiful job with this luggage, and there's not many cars that have this, so it's really nice. Something else they do on the Ferraris is also the service pack, so it's really nice. Now, some of these have got lost over the years and some of them are still with the car, so it's really nice to see. This one's got the dealer guide in here, all the service book, all the service history. I mean, in some ways, a car without history, some people just walk away from. So these are colossally valuable, whilst being really nice and beautifully made. They are cars, you do need to use them, so there's a certain amount of usability of these things. Apart from this thing being ferociously fast and extremely cool, it does have to have a practicality about it. So you can see in the front, you have got a bit of space to put stuff, and like we've just shown, if you've got the Shidoni luggage, you're probably not going to use it. It's nice to have, but you can put coats and holdalls if you're going out for the day or going to a Ferrari event or something. At least you can put stuff in there. Toolkit-wise, the F40s are quite nice. I mean, they're one of the few cars that they run Velcro. It's the only one I've never known do this. They put Velcro in the back. I think they started to do it with some of the later cars of 599s and things to stop this sliding around. So you've got this beautiful toolkit in here, all the usual things, all the Ferrari spanners. Ferrari do, and I think one of the reasons Ferrari toolkits generally are so collectible is they do a really nice kit. They've got beautiful Ferrari spanners. Now you've got your bulb kit in there, the great big wheel socket and everything. They put effort into all these things. It's really nice. Now it's all branded. The original toolkits used to have a little paper sticker on with the chassis number on, so they were allocated at the factory. In here you've got your tyre mousse, again, all Ferrari approved and Ferrari stamped. I mean, you can see this one's still dated. It's got the original one in 1993, so this is probably quite a late car. All these were changed at every service. We used to change these at every service. Not many people do now. So, and again, Velcro to keep it all in place. So it's a nice little touch again. Little things that you just think, yeah, there's a bit of thought gone in there. The other thing on these is stampings and numbers. Now, Ferrari throughout the ages, find something to sit on here. When cars are built at the factory, you get the chassis number, but when parts come off, like the front clams, the rear clams, sometimes doors, the older cars, the 250s, used to do it with bumpers. Anything that was shiny, that was taken off and fabricated for that car, they'd stamp it with a number. So you'd get lots of numbers around the car, bumpers, headlight rims, bits that were taken off during production that went off to have something else done and then came back to go onto that car. It was just a way of saying, right, that's the bumper for that car, that's the clam for that car. So you'll find behind these panels and places, various places around the car where you know where to look, things that have been taken off and they go back to the original car. So obviously now, if you know where they all are, you can go and find them. And if you can find a clam number, you know that that's the original clam, the car hasn't been crashed. So if you've got a numbered front and there's numbers in the back, you know that the car hasn't been in an accident, as well as the chassis numbers and what have you. So it's a way of authenticating the cars today as to where the good ones and the bad ones are. Sometimes they're quite hard to find, and they're not always in the same place, being Italian, but you can find them. Cooling system wise, while we're down here, obviously got the radiators with twin fans. These don't have a problem with overheating, these things. Bearing in mind the colossal size of the engine, the pipework comes through the car, through the radiators to the front with a couple of fans, and it works. It does make the cabin quite hot. So looking inside the cockpit of one of these things, as I just said from looking at the front, they do get very hot in here. You've got the main tunnel, which houses all the coolant pipes that go under through the car. It does get hot. You've got this huge engine in the back, which does radiate. There's a bit of insulation there, but it does radiate through. So you'll find that air conditioning, even though it's a fairly basic system, it's almost essential in one of these to make it a bit more hospitable whilst you're on a long journey. Other than that, I mean, there was no frills in one of these. All bare carbon. I mean, electric manual windows, because electrics are all too heavy. Just a little bit of cable to open the door. 3 pedals, traditional Ferrari gear lever, small space in the middle just to keep small items and bits and pieces, and that was it really. One of the things that has been a bit of a problem on these is the seat coverings. We've got some plastic here. We put like 2 or 3 seat covers on these when we drive these. It's like a Nomex racing sort of covering. It's notoriously hard to clean, and it's actually quite fragile. You find cars that where people have got in and out for a long period of time, it does actually wear. And for years this stuff wasn't available, but now Ferrari have reproduced the cloth and you can get them retrimmed. Seats were one of the options that you could have if you were a new owner of one of these. I think from memory it was 3. It was the width, whether you had sort of wider seats or narrower seats. I think there was either 2 or 3 options, but you had a choice of seats. Other options on the car, the later cars had, as I said before, the active suspension. So going through the evolution of these, the very first cars had Lexon windows. They had like the racing windows with little sliding panels on. Then they went to wind-up windows to be a little bit more civilised, and then they went to cat cars. So you get for emissions, you had cat cars and non-cat cars, and lifting cars, which was the suspension lift, which lifts it up a little bit just so you could get over speed humps and what have you. So that was sort of basically 3 main options for these, depending on when you bought it. And then seat sizes, some had fire extinguishers. You could have a fire extinguisher from the factory. They would plumb you in a fire extinguisher. And that was about it, really. So I suppose better fire it up and get out in this one. You could either have the harnesses, which are quite cool, but they're not the best for road use, or you could have inertia reel seat belts. Harnesses, whilst they do hold you in, they're a bit of a fiddle to put on and off for road cars. And as I said before, get the seat right. It's always nice to have a car with a process. There's something about pushing a button, a bit like the 288s, and things bursting into life. Basic bits inside, yes, we've got wipers, we've got washers, we've got indicators, we've got a couple of switches here, we've got some lights, but that's it. You've got very simple gauges. You've got a rev counter, a speedo, I've got a boost gauge, I've got my temperatures. It just tells me what I want and I need to know, nothing else. There's no frills. I've got oil temperature, I've got how much oil pressure I've got, and I've got any fuel in it. That's it. You don't need any more in one of these. I must say as well, this car is in for service. We've just serviced it, done some cam belts and bits on it. We're extremely grateful. All the cars that we drive, we have the permission of the owners, and we're very grateful for saying, look, no, can we use your car for the next film? And so we're able to share this for you. We need to just run this through, get it through the temperatures, get some temperature into it all, recheck all the levels and everything, just make sure we've got boost. We're not going to be going mad today. There's no way we're going to be doing full boost in one of these, but just and for the point of this video, there's people with racetracks and whatever that have shown you how fast these cars go. They've been down runways. It is an astonishing car. They are so fast. Over the years, I've taken people out in these cars and they've been banging the dashboards. These are people that have got Ferraris and gone, crikey, I've never realised these were this much faster than a normal Ferrari. These are very quick cars, so you do have to respect them. But on the other hand, you can drive them quite normally. I mean, we're driving along now, reasonably comfortable. The pedals and things aren't ridiculously heavy to operate. So little things I'm starting to notice on this, the steering wheel's slightly out of line, so I'm going to sort that out. Just wind the window up so you can hear. And this is already sort of starting to come up to temperature now, this one. They are quite bumpy, they are quite go-karty, but that's the enjoyment of these things. And the other thing you see on these, you can't see a lot out the back. I don't know if we swing the camera around. There's not a lot of visibility out the back of these things. You've got a big perspex engine cover that gets misted up. You can't see a lot. The mirrors aren't too bad. You can just about see a bit of wing, see. They're not the best for visibility. Straight away you can just feel the boost coming in. Just change gear before it goes off. What I'm looking for is just that it's performing nicely, there's no misfires, no shakes or bangs. As I always say, if you can get a car right going slowly, especially on something like this when it's going up, warp factor 2 and the hair on fire, it's hard to see whether they're missing or whatever. So you've always looked for the brake judder and how the thing feels low down. Here we go. So these cars catch you out. You just have to respect these things. It comes in with such a banger. Wallop you're off before you even know it. A fantastic car. So things I'm looking for now, things are warming up. Obviously on the public highway we can't go completely around this, but obviously we need to make sure that the boost is working. So in a higher gear, as you just squeeze it, you can feel the boost coming in. I can look at the boost gauge and I'm looking for that it's coming up to a sensible boost. We had a car in earlier for service and it was only getting low boost, and it had a problem with the boosting system. So hard as it is to road test a 200-mile-an-hour supercar, somehow we've got to make sure it works. So I can see here that it is boosting nicely without going at stupid speeds. At the end of the day, it's always hard driving a car of this value, but these are colossally valuable, these things. And it is someone else's, so you have to respect this. Some other things I'm looking for now, I start to check things like the cooling system, the air conditioning system, seeing what's coming on there, seeing if that's all working satisfactorily. And generally getting a feel for the car. This feels really nice. I've got no vibration. I've got lovely burbling noise on overrun. You can just hear it burbling a little bit. All our gauges are all starting to do what they should do. So this is another car. It's been in, we've done service, as I've just said, sort of bag tanks, bits and pieces. This is a cat car non-adjust, this one. But the big thing on this one, it's got a noisy exhaust. It's got a sports exhaust on, so you'll hear in a minute that it's a completely different experience. It's been sat in storage through the winter, so now as you can see the sun shines out, so we're just going to run it ready for delivery. So we press the magic button and you can already hear this one's a lot different. It's got a completely different exhaust on it. So there you have it, the iconic and simply one of the best cars ever built, the Ferrari F40. One of the things we do now, due to the dry sump system in the engines, you always do the engine oil hot rather than cold, because there's so much oil in the system, it actually expands. So if you do them when they're cold, you overfill them. So we real check that, we re-torque the wheel bolts. I'm just listening now for fans cutting in, things like that. We'll do the final checks and go around the car. these cars are so cool and so good. I hope I've given you some sort of insight into what they're like to live with.